Your announcement today, are you concerned that the company...
Well, they become very rich companies very fast, and the whole thing with vaping is been very profitable.
Welcome, everybody. It's a live stream. It's a strategy session. Joining me now is the great Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk. Many of you know this channel. It's a YouTube progressive monster, but some of you don't. So I would recommend you going over there and checking it out and clicking the subscribe button. Hit us with a super chat during the stream. Kyle, thanks for being here, man. How are you?
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it. And let me just say real quick, because this just struck me right this second.
Yeah.
I'm used to listening to you on 1.5 speed, so it sounds like you're like all Xanaxed out on me right now.
I'm ready to meet Jordan Peterson at rehab.
Oh boy, I saw that story too. Goodness gracious.
We don't even have time for that. But don't worry. See, I will just say people confused me wishing him a successful recovery because I take that seriously across the board with confusing the fact that I won't be doing some type of impression of him completely zonked out of his mind. And I assure you that those things are not mutually exclusive. So stay tuned. Kyle, the House has finally come into formation on impeachment. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so, this is one of those things where I know that even with my own audience, what I'm going to say is probably not going to be all that popular because I'm raining on everybody's parade and nobody likes a buzzkill. But, I've thought about this issue quite a bit, and I hate to say that I only see it ending one way. And I wish that I could be talked out of this utterly nihilistic feeling I have. But, I honestly think here's what could potentially happen. So let's say they do this impeachment inquiry and then, they take it to the House floor, which, by the way, is an open question as to whether or not they'll actually even take it to the House floor for a vote. But so let's say they do the impeachment inquiry. They go to the House floor. It could get through the House because all you need is a simple majority. Yep. But then when you get in the Senate, you need 2/3. So there's quite literally a 0% chance of that happening.
Right.
So
definitely.
In other words, I think that what would happen is Trump would win out in the Senate, and then he would have to get a round of press where they say, he's Teflon Don, and then his base is revitalized for 2020. I mean, that's the only potential scenario that I could see unfolding. I want to be wrong, but I just don't see anything else happening. So I think it would be a giant waste of time at best. At worst, it actually helps him massively.
We just have a tweet up. President Trump coming right out of the gate with all in bold letters, presidential harassment. So at least it's already good on a comedy level. Here's what I think. And this is one of my takes where I'm incredibly superficial and dispositional. So my thing with impeachment is, and I'll get to the more substantive things that maybe we could be a little bit more optimistic about, in a second. But I want to just, stipulate the obvious up front. Of course, he's not going to get removed from office. That's a given. I think that when Rashida Tlaib came out and said, impeach the MFer, I was okay, if you do it like that, I support it. In other words, if the attitude is we're going to finally be ruthless and not just a bunch of process nerds, right, who can't keep up with this administration and Republicans, we always get rolled, we're not aggressive, and we're just going to throw political bombs the same way Republicans do and just have swag and incidentally, be right on at least some merits. Because as far as I'm concerned, I know very little about this Ukraine story. It's actually it's interesting. It's worth looking at. But, there's the emoluments clause. There's, frankly, crime. I would absolutely call crimes against humanity at the border. There's plenty of grounds to do this. So I feel my concern was always like, I was just like, do it or don't, right? Like, if you're not going to do it because you're too like, this is not, you don't think it's tactically advisable, then just shut up about it. But if you're going to do it, go at it hard. And frankly, I wish they had done it several months ago with just that sort of attitude. I think what is potentially positive is it gums up the works. They're fighting impeachment instead of wheeling out their agenda every day. I mean, that's literal eating up of human capital. I think the base thing goes either way. I think that, I think you and I, frankly, we're a little bit more jaundiced, right? Like, of course, Trump is insanely corrupt, like, of course, but we also understand that there's a dual tier justice system across this country, that there's systemic corruption. So I don't think the West Wing music doesn't go off for us, and we would prefer to spend the next several months and year talking about single payer and income inequality and the real systemic crises. But this does juice a lot of people up. So I think the base thing goes both ways.
So I hope that that's true, and I want that to be true. But here are my concerns about that. So I think one of the biggest problems is that they decidedly won't do it the way that you want them to do it, which is the way that could be politically advantageous. And what I mean by that is, if you get 4 House Democrats together, you will get 4 different reasons for impeachment. And it's just massively scattershot. The underlying premise of everything that all of them say is just Trump is really bad. And they simply do not know how to play politics in that same top-down way that the Republicans do. So if you are to go about doing impeachment, the way that I would go about doing it, first of all, I wouldn't touch Mueller or this Ukraine shit with a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't be anywhere near it because I think it's so politically impotent that nothing will come of it. But if you were to do impeachment, I would make a case that it's an emoluments case that leads into genocide in Yemen. So basically, Donald Trump is taking money through his D.C. hotel from Saudi Arabia, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're overpaying on purpose. And then lo and behold, this guy's giving them endless weapons deals and helping them commit a genocide in Yemen. So if you were to do it, that's the road I would go down because there's the most there with that. But I fear that, as the Democrats always seem to do, it's like a natural law. They always default to the worst possible anti-Trump arguments. And I mentioned this on my show the other day. Looking at the Ukraine thing, the way that they're talking about it, they're like, good sir, I can't believe you would, prod foreign governments to try to get dirt on your political opponents. And it's like, well, I can. That's exactly something that I could think of Trump doing. But furthermore, what do you do when there's actually dirt there? Do you just pretend like we're not allowed to have that conversation about the Bidens? And this is what they always do, Michael, and it drives me crazy. It's like, and in fact, Hillary Clinton also did the exact same thing in 2016 when it came to Trump. And it was literally with the exact same government, the Ukrainian government, and they got dirt on Paul Manafort. And guess what? When that dirt came out, I wasn't on my show going, how dare you? The way that you got that information was so impure and impolite and uncivil. I was like, no, Paul Manafort's insanely corrupt. So by the same token, I'll be saying Joe Biden and his son are insanely corrupt because they are. So I just feel like they always go to the worst possible arguments. So I don't see it ending well. However, you did make one really good point in there that landed with me, which is if this ends up eating their agenda so they can't do anything else, then that's awesome. But the other thing that might happen is it sucks all of the air out of the room for the election, and you don't get as much more coverage of the primary election because it's all about impeachment. And that might have the downside of impacting Bernie in a negative way because his word doesn't get out there as much. And I hope that that's not the case. But at least you gave me one bright spot to think about, which is it could eat their agenda.
I think that's the bright spot. I love your case for impeachment. That would be the reason to remove him from office. Genocide in Yemen and I love that. I think, and I mean, I also just think in general, yes, look, Trump always takes the extra step. So it's extra if it's true that he held up an aid package to Ukraine, which, we could get into in a separate question, right? But that is like a next level of mixing. But it is amazing that Democrats never, not only did Hillary, I mean, I don't think that there's a single modern politician that wouldn't theoretically take it. And there's other examples like, actually it was a minor scandal when Bill Clinton was running for president because supposedly some of his Vietnam records were released by the John Major government at the time because they were sympathetic to the Republicans, and that, caused tensions with the Clinton camp. And I think you're right. I mean, just in general, this whole, smelling salts thing has to go. But, it's not. And that brings us to, really this new sort of, honestly, the meat of what we're talking about, which is, I think, certain classes of primarily bougie upper middle class people and technocrats, some of whom might even want to brand themselves as left or progressive, desperately searching for straws to vote for a radically less progressive candidate when the most progressive candidate in modern American history could actually become president. What is the case, and why is it such an easy, simple, why are we even talking about this case for Bernie Sanders over Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned in the segment that I did on this the other day, if you have a worldview that's a democratic socialist worldview or a social democratic worldview, this is really an empirical question. This isn't like, what flavor of bagel do you like? This is, square peg, round hole stuff. If you're trying to say Elizabeth Warren is equal to or better than Bernie on this stuff, it's just not true. So for one thing, she voted for Ben Carson to be the head of housing and urban development. Now, thankfully, in the second round of voting, she flipped because of a massive backlash. However, we don't want to have to babysit the person who's going to be our president. We want them to be on our side, and we know they're going to be on our side. And in the case of Elizabeth Warren, every now and then she drops a bomb on us where we're like, why did you just do that? That makes less than no sense. And it shows that she doesn't have the same political intuition as Bernie, or she might have decent political intuition, but she could easily get talked out of those positions, which are good. She also, of course, Bernie also wants to eliminate all student loan debt, and Elizabeth Warren doesn't. Bernie wants to eliminate all medical debt, and she doesn't. And one of the biggest things to me that really stuck with me is she told Cenk in an interview, quote, "Allow me to make a spirited defense of Joe Manchin." And so that's all I really need to know, because what you understand and what I understand and what people who follow this closely understand is we need a president who's not only willing to take on the Republicans, but a president who's also willing to stand up to the Democrats and either make them fall in line or even go as far as rallying against them in their own states and supporting primary challengers against them. And I asked that question point blank to Bernie, and he said, absolutely, I'll support primaries without pause.
Without pause.
That is fundamentally not Elizabeth Warren. She is a team player, and she even goes as far as to obfuscate all the other Democratic healthcare plans and Medicare for all. She makes it seem like, well, a public option and Medicare for all extra and Medicare for America and all these things. The core of it is the same. And the core of it is, we want to get more people healthcare. And she doesn't understand that, or it's cynical and she does get it, but she doesn't care that, all the other plans except the Bernie bill and the Jayapal bill are to one extent or another gaslighting to protect the status quo and protect the profits of the for-profit health insurance companies.
100%. And I just want to say really quickly, I mean, there's some kind of, there's some disagreement around, about Medicare for all. And, I am 1,000% in the, I get rid of private insurance camp. I mean, there's a number of practical as well as political reasons for that, frankly. Now, again, if you want to come up with some type of narrow, like, yes, could there be private insurance that takes care of like waxes in Aruba or something? Okay, fine. That's not what I'm talking about. But fundamentally, primary care getting put into a single payer system where doctors are not billing and there's no, private intermediaries. There's no, Pete Buttigieg Medicare for all who want it. I mean, we need a single payer universal system. That is what we know ethically, empirically will by far save the most lives. That's
right. And the core of it is the duplicative care provision, which is that you can't have private insurance offering that which is already covered. under a Medicare for all system.
Right.
So, if you want to be in favor of a supplemental system for all, whatever random little tidbits are not covered and are maybe experimental, well, that's totally fine. But the core of it is no duplicative care. And, I think the realm of debate that's reasonable when it comes to Medicare for all is, do you want a French-style system, which is public funding of private institutions, or do you want a UK-style system, which is public funding of public institutions? That's like the spectrum of debate that I think is reasonable when it comes to Medicare for all. And that's not the spectrum that she thinks is reasonable. She's more than willing to entertain the idea that a lot of these like very open half measures are serious, and they're just not. And then there's also, apart from the substantive stuff, there's also like real stylistic concerns in terms of electability.
Definitely.
So, I'm actually relatively agnostic on the question as to whether or not Elizabeth Warren would be able to beat Trump. But I do know this. We're not in a professorial political age. And that's what she is. She's a wonky technocrat. And, it's a street fighter, brawler, populist age right now. And that's what's landing. That's what we know is landing with the electorate. And when you have a candidate who's not only further left substantively, but is also stylistically hitting the nail on the head for today's political era, there's really no conceivable reason to think that Elizabeth Warren comes remotely near Bernie.
100%. And I just want to add two things. And one, I want to do, this is way less important, but a touch of a mea culpa, right? Because I'm starting to see echoes of the Democratic, the DNC leadership race between Keith Ellison and Tom Perez in the following way. That you had Ellison after 2016, you had like someone with legit progressive credentials who put his hat in the ring. And if you recall at that time, even Chuck Schumer backed him, right? There was some recognition amongst, even the most mediocre and venile like Chuck Schumer that we need to at least, pivot on branding. I've no doubt that it's not substantive in his case. That's obvious. And then the Obama team basically like behind the scenes kind of, and there was actually ended up being a lot of really disgusting dealings with the Puerto Rican delegation, which people should look into. It's another story, but it's a really important one. And Tom Perez gets elected. And I have to confess to something here, because partially because in some ways I really am to the left in terms of, having a pretty Marxist analytic perspective of most of these things. Sometimes I actually, and in this case, I was softer on the establishment than I should have been, which is I 100% supported Keith Ellison. But I was like, well, that's interesting because Tom Perez is like, he's another mediocre establishment hack, but he's a liberal one, right? And again, before people freak out, I'm not comparing. Obviously, Warren's an infinitely more impressive and better everything than Tom Perez. But the dynamic stands, which is that there is a progressive groundswell of momentum for an actual transformative agenda, which translates concretely to threatening incumbent interests inside the Democratic Party, donors, consultants, and candidates. And now Biden becomes, potentially implausible. Though I always like to remind people the whole thing has been a disaster for months. He still leads in the polls, which people should remind themselves of occasionally. And, okay, let's circle around Elizabeth Warren, who will assure the establishment and assure all the incumbent interests, and then they can, take care of their real enemy, which is Bernie. And I'll just say, continuing the case study, Tom Perez has been an absolute disaster. You need to uproot these things fundamentally.
Yeah. The good news, though, is that at least we're shifting the Overton window.
Right.
But the bad news is they have 1,000 tricks up their sleeve. And this actually reminds me of something that happened years ago so there's this real groundswell for, doing something on the issue of corruption and money in politics. And Jenks Wolfpack, for example, they had, a really strong amendment on that they were pushing for. And what's interesting is when there's enough noise, you do get a reaction from Congress, but their reaction is to say, oh, no, totally, we're with you. And then what they do is they propose a watered down piece of legislation that basically says like, okay, we need to go back to prior to Citizens United.
Right.
But what people don't recognize is Citizens United is not the only problem. Citizens United shot a dead horse. We have case law going back to like the 1970s, where the Supreme Court slowly but surely ruled on a variety of cases that effectively money equals free speech. So what's interesting is they'll try to harness that grassroots pressure and then redirect it in a way that's more palatable to their concerns. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Elizabeth Warren. Because if you had told me before this election cycle that, hey, Kyle, she's going to get wildly positive press, I would have said there's no way that that's true. There's no way she's going to get positive press. But I think there's this recognition that, okay, basically anybody but Bernie is going to be, palatable to them. So why not prop her up as the alternative and then pretend like, scold all the Bernie bros and say like, well, if you don't accept her, you're obviously just sexist.
Right. We'll play that same game again. I think, and again, right. We can't even get into that nonsense. But I think that, that's exactly right. And I think, it's very revealing. And last summer or last winter, really, the quotes from Wall Street people and profiles would say we're open to anybody besides Sanders or Warren. And now it's we need to stop Bernie Sanders.
That's right. It's morphed. You're so right.
And I just also want to add, and obviously I hit this a lot, but this is coming on the heels of a new, Council on Foreign Relations questionnaire, which I'm actually writing a piece on currently with Ben Burgess. And
I'll be covering that too, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, look, you're talking about, look, I don't even need to, we don't even need to use, hyperbole here. It's just like you said, when we were talking before we went on, totally conventional democratic foreign policy. Now, if you are somebody who claims any kind of international solidarity or progressive impulse, conventional democratic foreign policy is a catastrophe for human beings across the planet. So we're talking the same dead rhetoric on Venezuela. We're talking, yes, maybe I'll kind of wokeify the language on the Palestinians, but obviously we're never going to do. And look, there's one thing short of BDS, but that is actually remotely plausible for a presidential candidate to talk about, which is withholding aid. Bernie's put it on the table. Warren's never going to do it. There's nothing on Latin America. There's nothing on debt relief. There's, yes, withdraw from Afghanistan, which sounds good, but still a lot of rhetoric about securing our interests. And frankly, even if it's just as simple as there's no interest and no focus, well, all of the same retreads. That's how Samantha Power becomes Secretary of State. And we have another 4 years of catastrophic interventionist foreign policy.
Well, I just learned this the other day, but apparently Elizabeth Warren had spoken about Madeleine Albright being a close advisor to her on these issues.
Disaster.
She, quite literally said the death of 500,000 Iraqi civilians was okay.
A price we're comfortable paying, to paraphrase her. And also in the Council on Foreign Relations questionnaire, she renewed support of the Iran deal, but used rhetoric suggesting that the Iranians were at fault in ruining the deal. Now, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, that's what did you say? Like, that's squares and holes. Like, that is objectively false. Like, the United States ruined that agreement. The Iranians followed it, period.
That's right. And the scary thing is, because I remember our last conversation, we spoke about, socialist internationalism versus left isolation.
Right.
And she doesn't even hit the bar of left isolation.
Not at all.
Which is stunning, because domestically, I do think, and I kind of get a little frustrated when people don't give her due on issues involving Wall Street, on issues involving trade and taxation.
Absolutely. She's good.
I think she's very solid on those issues.
She's good on those issues. It's silly to pretend otherwise.
Is the foreign policy is just not even in the same galaxy.
I mean, yeah, and all I could say is, and one of the things I appreciate about you cover foreign policy a lot too, and I would just say, like, that's something that I'm just going to assert. If you're voting in the United States, you have to, especially if you're going to kind of consider yourself to be, a conscientious person voting, it really is like the ultimate narcissism to not factor that into your vote. And these are galaxies apart. I mean, and then even on the flip side, like, what is the difference between a global plan to deal with the climate crisis, which of course is a global crisis that involves technology transfer and joint investment with China and Russia as well as developing countries, which is essential, versus Thomas Friedman style eco-military?
Yeah. And, another thing, a point that's rarely made is that it's true that the area where the president has the most influence is on foreign policy. Like, you can get the most done because you're the commander in chief. So that's what you can impact the most. And that's the area where she's totally lacking. And by the way, we should mention Bernie has improved since 2016.
Significantly.
Right.
Significantly. Kyle, you sent this to me the other day, and this isn't even the best of the clip. We don't have enough time to go through all of it. You and I have talked for a long time about needing to dunk on Dummy Dave a little bit. Let's go back to the archives. This is a vintage panel, 2014. Jank, Anna, Dorr, and
Skinny
Ruben,
Jank.
and Dummy
Skinny
Dave.
Jank is there.
Check him out. And I just want to say, like, this is going to be funny, but this is literally in the context of him defending schools and hospitals being bombed in Gaza. But just watching him think and talk is funny. Let's take a little bit of time to enjoy that.
Hey, and that's all I have to say about it for today. Yes, look, from everything I understand, Hamas had 5 other ceasefires given to them that they would have gotten on better terms, where the tunnels weren't going to be allowed to still be destroyed. So they obviously were degraded to the point where they had to agree to something that they didn't want to agree to in the first place. So that's one point. And it sounds like even Obama said today that Hamas did break the ceasefire. So that's 2 things. Now anyone can say, well, you guys never believed the government, so why do you believe the government now? But I think for every story that we ever do, occasionally you got to pick something to believe, right? I mean, yes, I think the government lies all the time, but there's some, we got a lot of paper here, and sometimes you got to believe something. So, yes, it's really shitty. I don't feel any worse for the soldier or his family than anyone else that's died on the other side. But I do agree with the original point you made about what the Israeli narrative is, which is, what can they do? What can they do? They are in war. So when we show numbers, whatever it was, 1,600 versus 60 or something like that. Well,
Pause it. I just have to say, that is 1,600 Palestinian civilians versus 60 Israeli civilians. Now, we don't want civilians to die anywhere, but there is something illustrative about that number that Dave might be missing here. But let's just do 30 more seconds. I've never heard war crimes defended in such a funny way.
So true.
What can they do? They are in war. So when we show numbers, whatever it was, 1,600 versus 60 or something like that. Well, in the last 8 years, they've invested in the Iron Dome, which has saved their people. And not only has the Iron Dome saved their people, the Iron Dome has actually saved Palestinians. Because think about it, if the Iron Dome wasn't there and these rockets were all landing, well, if you think Israel's response is harsh now, well, just imagine how much harsher it would be if these rockets were landing. So the Iron Dome has saved lives on both sides.
All right, Kyle. I love that. I just think, when you think about it, the Iron Dome is helping the Palestinians.
No, so the thing that's like next level hilarious is I don't even know what it means when he goes, you got to believe something, and you got a lot of paper here, so like you got to believe something. What does that mean? What does that mean that you have a lot of paper?
He's literally saying that, and what I love is that I love it because I actually think at this point, because I just heard, I think Dave is doing some type of fundraiser, if I understand correctly, for like literally the neo-fascist party in Canada. Like, I think Dave as like a crazy, Glenn Beck associate he's probably way more ideologically committed than he ever was. But what I love about this is it's just like, what I get from this clip is he's just like, yeah, the government, and I'm here because I like to do like mediocre jokes about Obama being a cool dad. And, I think women should be able to have abortions. And this is the first topic we've ever talked about that I have any commitment to. And I'm just going to say we should just believe the official narrative on this one.
So true. Like, that's exactly what he's saying. By the way, his argument of, well, on one side, there's like, 1,600 people that have been killed. On the other side, there's 60. And he argues like, well, people are using that to say like one side is more wrong. And he's saying like, he's trying to act like that's an absurd position to take. Like, man, are you against the people who are killing way more civilians? Wow, that's so irrational.
There's the picture of the kids bombed on the beach, and everybody can use that, but I just don't know if we're really thinking.
The best part of that is much later on, and it's funny because you can see the entire time there. So Cenk is trying to play like referee in that conversation,
right?
And he's doing a pretty decent job of it. And then you could see that the more Dave talks, Jimmy Dore sits there, and you could see his anger level like slowly rising, where his face is getting red. And then when he finally speaks, he like blurts out, he starts like berating Dave and saying like, I can safely say that the people who are bombing schools are wrong, Dave. You can't?
But can you though? I don't know. I mean, we don't always believe the government, but oh my God,
man.
watch that
That's
clip.
A classic clip. People should watch that.
Dave's really stupid. He's also a bad person. Kyle Kulinski, you are the exact opposite. Incredibly smart, incredibly good dude. Really appreciate you. Everybody check out Secular Talk. I'm pretty sure most of you have. But there are new people. People are actually, I feel like more and more people are coming to YouTube every day in general. Kyle, thanks a million, brother.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed talking about ideas with you.
Ideas. Thanks, brother.
All right, man. Have a good one.
All right, bye-bye. We'll be back here live in about 25 minutes.